They said the clock didn't just tell time. It took something from you every time it ticked wrong. And in Dust Hollow, men believed that kind of thing the same way they believed the sun would rise, slow and stubborn over the red hills. Ethan Cole didn't believe in curses, not anymore. Not after losing everything a man could lose without dying. But belief has a way of finding you when you've got nothing left to argue with. And that's exactly where he was the night he walked into the saloon with $2 in his pocket and dust on his boots. The place smelled like old wood, spilled whiskey, and the kind of stories that never ended well, and every eye turned just long enough to remember who he was. The rancher who couldn't keep cattle alive. The man bad luck followed like a shadow that didn't belong to him. He didn't look back at them, just stepped up to the counter, fingers brushing the worn edge of the wood as if grounding himself in something solid, something real, but even the wood felt tired beneath his hand. "You hear about the clock?" Someone muttered from the corner, low enough to pretend it wasn't meant for him, but loud enough that it was, and Ethan didn't answer, because men like him learned early that answering only gave people more to take. Then the barkeep set it down between them, slow, almost careful, like it might bite if handled wrong. A gold pocket watch, heavy, scratched, older than anything else in that room. Its surface dull under the lantern light, except for one thin line where the metal had been worn smooth by time or touch. $5 says you won't hold it till sunrise, the barkeep said, voice flat, eyes not quite meeting Ethan's, and the room shifted, quiet settling in like a held breath. Ethan glanced at the clock, then at the coins in his palm. Not enough for anything that mattered, but maybe enough to prove something that didn't. And that was usually how trouble started out here. "What's the catch?" he asked, voice rough and used, and someone laughed, a short sound that didn't carry humor so much as memory. "No catch," another voice said. "Just don't lose anything before morning." And that made a few heads turn, made a few men stare into their drinks like they'd seen what that meant. Ethan picked up the clock, and it felt colder than it should, heavier too, like it wasn't just metal but something else pressed into it, something that didn't belong in a man's hand. The lid clicked open with a soft sound, and inside, the face was clean, untouched, the kind of craftsmanship you didn't see anymore, except the second hand. It wasn't moving right. It paused, then jumped, then stilled again like it couldn't decide what moment it belonged to. "It's broken," Ethan said, almost to himself, but the barkeep shook his head once, slow. "No," he said, "it's working just fine." And that was when the ticking started, faint at first, uneven, like a heartbeat heard through too many walls. Ethan closed the lid and slipped the watch into his coat pocket, the weight settling against his chest like it had always been there, like it had been waiting. "Sunrise," he said, and tossed his $2 onto the counter, not looking at the men around him, not seeing the way some of them leaned back just a little, as if distance might matter. Outside, the night had already settled in, the kind of dark that swallowed sound and left only the wind moving through the empty street, carrying dust and something colder beneath it. Ethan walked past the last building, past the edge of town where the lamps stopped trying, and out toward the small stretch of land he still called his. Though there wasn't much left to claim, the fence leaned. The barn stood half in shadow, and the well hadn't given him more than a trickle in weeks. But he didn't stop to look, didn't stop for anything, just went inside and set the clock on the table beside his bed. The ticking followed him, quiet but wrong, like it was out of step with the night itself. And when he lay down, boots still on, hat tipped low over his eyes, he told himself it was just a watch, just metal and gears, just another bad decision in a long line of them. But sometime, past midnight, when the wind dropped and the world went still enough to hear your own thoughts, the ticking changed. It slowed, then stopped, and in that silence, something shifted, not in the room, not in the land, but in the space between moments, the kind of space a man doesn't notice until it's gone. Ethan's eyes opened before he knew why, the dark pressing in around him, thicker now, heavier, and for a second he didn't move, didn't breathe, because the quiet felt wrong in a way he couldn't name. Then the clock snapped open on its own, the lid clicking back with a sharp, deliberate sound, and a thin line of pale light slipped across the room, catching on the inside of the case where something had been hidden all along. A mark, carved deep into the metal, worn but still there. A symbol he didn't recognize but somehow understood wasn't meant for him. The ticking didn't return, not yet, and in the stillness that followed, Ethan pushed himself up slowly, eyes fixed on that open watch, on the mark that seemed to pull at something just beneath his ribs. Outside, the wind rose again, soft at first, then carrying with it the faint sound of movement. Not close, not far, just enough to remind him he wasn't alone in this night. And for the first time since he'd walked into that saloon, Ethan Cole felt it. Not fear, not exactly, but the weight of something he hadn't chosen, something that had chosen him. And somewhere beyond the thin walls of his cabin, unseen in the dark, a figure stood still as stone, watching the light from that open clock and waiting for him to understand what he was already holding. The mark inside the clock did not fade when he blinked, did not shift with the light. It stayed there, carved deep into the metal, like it had been waiting years for someone to finally see it. And Ethan Cole stood there in the quiet of his cabin with the night pressing in around him, feeling the weight of something he could not yet name. The ticking had not returned, and that silence felt louder than any sound he had ever heard. Like the land itself was holding its breath, he reached out slowly, fingers brushing the edge of the open case. And for a moment he hesitated, because a man learns when to leave things alone. But he had already crossed that line the second he took it from the saloon. When his thumb pressed against the inner lid, the metal felt warm now, not cold like before, and that made him pull back just a fraction before forcing himself to look closer. The carving was not random, not decoration. It was deliberate, lines curved and intersecting in a way that spoke of meaning, of language. And though he had never learned the symbols of the Apache, something in his chest tightened, as if memory lived there without permission. Outside, the wind shifted direction, brushing along the walls of the cabin in a low whisper, carrying with it the scent of dry earth and something faintly sweet like sage burned long ago. Ethan closed the watch, and the moment the lid snapped shut, the ticking returned. But it was different now, steadier, slower, like it had found a rhythm it approved of. He slipped it back into his coat, but the weight no longer felt like metal. It felt like expectation. He stepped outside without thinking, boots crunching against the dirt, eyes scanning the dark horizon where the land stretched wide and empty, except it did not feel empty anymore. There was a presence there, not close enough to see, but close enough to feel, the way a man senses another behind him before he hears the step. He turned, slowly, hand hovering near his side, not in threat, but in instinct. And that was when he saw her. She stood just beyond the edge of the dim lantern light spilling from the cabin door, still as the posts along his fence. Her figure outlined by the faint glow of the sky, long dark hair resting over her shoulders, her eyes fixed not on him but on the pocket where the clock rested. She did not step forward, did not call out. She simply watched, and there was something in that stillness that carried more weight than any shouted warning. Ethan did not speak at first, because words felt like they might break something fragile between them. And finally he said, low and careful, "You have been standing there long." And her gaze lifted to meet his, steady, unafraid, carrying a quiet strength that did not need to prove itself. "Long enough," she answered, her voice soft but clear, shaped by a cadence that did not belong to this town. The wind moved again, lifting the edge of her shawl, and Ethan noticed the patterns stitched into it. Symbols not unlike the one inside the clock. He took a step closer, slow, deliberate, giving her time to move if she chose, but she did not. "You know what this is," he said, not a question, and her eyes shifted briefly to the coat at his chest before returning to his face. "I know what it was meant to be," she replied, and there was a difference in those words that settled heavy between them. Ethan frowned slightly, the lines at the corners of his eyes deepening as he studied her. "They say it is cursed," he said, and she almost smiled, not with humor, but with something like patience worn thin over time. "They say many things," she answered, "especially when they do not understand what they have taken." The word taken lingered, and Ethan felt it, the way it pressed against the back of his thoughts. "Taken from who?" he asked, and for a moment she did not answer, her gaze drifting past him toward the land, toward the dark stretch where the hills rose and fell like the backs of sleeping animals. "From those who trusted," she said finally, and the quiet in her voice carried more weight than anger ever could. Ethan glanced back toward the cabin, toward the table where the clock had opened itself, revealing what it had hidden, and he felt something shift inside him. Not belief, not yet, but the beginning of something that might become it. If it is not a curse, he said, turning back to her, then why does everything around it fall apart? And she stepped forward then, just enough for the lantern light to reach her face, revealing eyes that held stories older than anything he had known. Because it does not belong where it is, she said, and her gaze dropped once more to his coat. And it does not forget where it came from. The ticking grew louder then, not in sound but in presence, like each second pressed harder against the space between them, and Ethan felt it, the pull, the sense that the answer he wanted was not one she would give freely. "What is your name?" he asked, and she held his gaze for a long moment before answering. "Nayeli," she said, and the name settled into the air like something that had always been there. "Ethan Cole," he replied, though she had likely already known, and she nodded once, acknowledging not the name but the man behind it. "You will need to choose," she said, and the words came without warning, simple, direct, carrying a weight he did not yet understand. "Choose what?" he asked, but she had already begun to step back, retreating into the dark the same way she had appeared. "Before it chooses for you," she answered, her voice fading with the distance, leaving him standing alone once more with the ticking in his chest, and the sense that the night had only just begun to show him what it had been holding back. The night did not settle after she left. It stretched, thin and restless, like the land itself was listening, and Ethan Cole remained standing where she had been, eyes fixed on the darkness as if it might return her if he waited long enough. But the only thing that answered him was the steady, uneven ticking against his chest. He exhaled slowly and turned back toward the cabin, though each step felt heavier than the last, like the ground had changed without him noticing. Inside, the lantern flame flickered low, casting long shadows across the walls, and the clock, though hidden in his coat, seemed louder now, each second landing with a quiet insistence that made it impossible to ignore. He took it out again, placing it carefully on the table, and for a moment it behaved like any ordinary thing, the lid closed, the face unseen. But Ethan had already learned that this object did not stay ordinary for long. He leaned over it, hands resting on the worn wood, and waited, not for anything in particular, just for the next sign that he was no longer in control of what he had taken. The ticking slowed, then paused again, and without his touch, the lid opened just enough to reveal that same carved mark, catching the lantern light in a way that made it seem almost alive. Ethan's jaw tightened, not in fear, but in the recognition that whatever this was, it was not done with him yet. Outside, the wind shifted once more, carrying a low sound across the open land, not voices, not quite, but something rhythmic, something deliberate, and it drew his attention like a thread. Pulled tight, he stepped out again, the cold air brushing against his face, sharper now, and his eyes followed the direction of the sound toward the far edge of his property, where the land dipped slightly before rising into the hills. There was movement there, faint, distant, shapes that did not belong to the stillness of the night. Ethan narrowed his gaze, trying to make sense of it, but the darkness held its secrets close, offering only the suggestion of presence, not the certainty. The ticking behind him, left on the table inside, suddenly grew louder, as if it too had noticed, and Ethan turned back, stepping quickly into the cabin. The clock was no longer still, the hands moving now with purpose, not following any time he recognized, but marking something else entirely. He watched as the minute hand jerked forward, then back, then settled, pointing not to a number, but to a faint line etched into the face itself, a line he had not seen before. His breath slowed, his focus narrowing, because now there was direction, however small, however strange. He reached for the clock, and as his fingers closed around it, the ticking steadied again, matching something deep and quiet inside him. He stepped outside once more, holding it at chest level, eyes shifting between the watch and the dark horizon, and as he turned slowly, the hand inside seemed to respond, adjusting, guiding, until it aligned with that same distant place where the shapes had moved. Ethan stood there for a long moment, the realization settling in, not sudden, but steady, like dawn creeping over the hills. It was not counting time. It was pointing, leading, asking. He glanced once more toward the edge of his land, then back at the cabin, at the small life he had managed to hold together despite everything. And he understood, not fully, but enough to know that staying would not answer anything. The memory of Naeli's words returned. Quiet but clear, you will need to choose, and for the first time. The choice did not feel like something being taken from him, but something being offered. He stepped back inside, gathering what little he needed, a coat, a canteen, a lantern he did not light, because the night already had its own way of showing what mattered. Before leaving, he paused, looking once more at the table where the clock had first opened, where the mark had revealed itself, and something in his expression shifted, not resolve exactly, but acceptance. He stepped out again, closing the door behind him without sound, and began to walk, following the direction the clock now insisted upon, each step measured, deliberate, as if the land itself was guiding his feet. The wind carried the scent of sage again, stronger now, and beneath it, something older, something that did not belong to the town or the life he had known. Behind him, the cabin stood quiet, untouched, but ahead, the dark stretched wide and waiting, holding answers that would not come to a man who stayed still. The ticking remained steady as he moved, no longer uneven, no longer uncertain, and for the first time since he had taken it, Ethan Cole felt that it was not working against him, but with him, though he could not yet say why. The shapes in the distance grew clearer as he approached, not figures now, but markers, stones set in a line that curved gently with the land, leading deeper toward the hills where the night seemed thicker, heavier. He slowed as he reached the first of them, crouching slightly to run his fingers over the surface, and there it was again, the same mark, carved deep, worn by time, but not erased. Ethan exhaled, a quiet sound that carried more understanding than words could. And as he stood, the ticking paused once more, the lid opening just a fraction, as if waiting for him to take the next step not with his feet, but with his choice, and somewhere beyond the line of stones, unseen but not unfelt, Naeli watched in silence, knowing that the man who had once been led by loss was now being led by something else entirely, something that did not demand, did not force, but waited. And if you have stayed this far, tell me in the comments where you are watching from, and leave a like if you feel the weight of a story that moves without raising its voice. The stones did not end where Ethan expected them to. They curved instead, bending with the land like they had been placed by hands that understood the shape of the earth better than any map could show. And as he followed them deeper into the hills, the air changed, cooler, quieter, carrying less of the dry dust from town and more of something older, something that did not belong to fences or ownership. The ticking in his hand slowed again, not stopping, just easing, as if it recognized where it was being taken. And Ethan found himself matching his steps to that rhythm without thinking, his boots pressing softly into the ground that felt firmer here, less disturbed. The moon slipped behind a stretch of thin cloud, and the world dimmed, but not enough to hide what lay ahead. A low rise in the land where the stones gathered closer together, forming something more deliberate, more intentional than a simple path. He paused at the edge of it, his breath steady but shallow, because there was a difference between following and arriving, and he could feel it now, the weight of crossing from one into the other. He crouched again, brushing his fingers along the nearest stone, tracing the carved mark that matched the one inside the clock, and this time he noticed something else, faint lines branching outward from it, patterns that connected one stone to the next, like a map laid across the ground itself. Ethan straightened slowly, eyes lifting to follow those invisible lines, and for a moment the land shifted in his mind, no longer random, no longer empty, but structured, purposeful, telling a story he was only just beginning to read. The clock grew warmer in his hand, the metal no longer cold but carrying a steady heat that pulsed in time with the ticking. And when he opened it again, the hands had changed position, no longer pointing outward toward the horizon but inward, toward the center of the stone circle. He stepped forward without hesitation now, drawn by something stronger than curiosity, something that felt like recognition, though he had never been here before. The ground within the circle was different, smoother. The dust settled in a way that suggested it had been left undisturbed for a long time. and as he moved toward the center, the ticking slowed to a near halt, each second stretching longer than the last. He stopped when the sound faded completely, the silence returning, but no longer heavy, no longer wrong. Just still, like the moment before a word is spoken. Ethan lowered the clock, eyes scanning the ground, searching for whatever it was that this place held, and at first he saw nothing, just earth and stone and the faint outline of time itself. But then the lantern light from his unlit lamp caught something. A subtle change in the surface, a line too straight to be natural, too deliberate to be ignored. He knelt again, brushing away a thin layer of dust with the back of his hand, and there it was, a narrow seam in the ground, barely visible, running just a few inches before disappearing beneath the packed earth. His breath caught, not in surprise, but in understanding, because this was no accident, no forgotten place left to chance. This had been made to be found, but only by someone who knew where to look, or who carried the thing that could show them. He placed the clock gently on the ground beside the seam, and for a moment nothing happened, the night holding its quiet, the land offering no answer. And then the lid of the clock opened once more, slowly this time, deliberately, and the faintest sound returned, not ticking, not quite, but something softer, like a memory moving through time instead of measuring it. The seam in the earth shifted, just slightly, the dust settling in a way that revealed more of its shape, and Ethan felt it. Again, that pull, that quiet insistence that this was not about taking, not about claiming, but about seeing what had been hidden. He did not reach for it yet, did not force it open, because something in him understood that this place did not respond to force, it responded to choice, to patience, to the willingness to listen before acting. He lifted his gaze then, scanning the edges of the circle, and there, just beyond the nearest stone, she stood again, Nayeli, exactly where the shadows met. The light, her presence as steady as the ground beneath his feet. She had not approached, had not spoken. She simply watched, her eyes moving from the clock to the seam and back to him, as if measuring not what he would do, but how he would choose to do it. Ethan rose slowly, brushing the dust from his hands, and met her gaze across the short distance, the silence between them carrying more meaning than any question he could ask. "This is where it leads," he said, his voice low, not breaking the quiet so much as joining it, and she inclined her head just enough to acknowledge the truth of it. "This is where it remembers," she replied, and the difference in those words settled deeper than anything he had heard before. Ethan looked back down at the ground, at the seam that now seemed less like a hidden door and more like a boundary, a line between what had been buried and what was waiting to be seen again. The clock rested beside it, open, still, as if its work for this moment was done, and Ethan felt the weight of the next step, not in his hands, but in his choice, knowing that whatever lay beneath was not meant to be taken lightly, not meant to be taken at all unless he understood why. It had been hidden in the first place, and the night held that moment with him, stretching it just long enough for him to feel the truth of it before he moved. The ground did not open the way a man might expect, no sudden movement, no sound of shifting earth, just a quiet giving, like something long sealed had finally decided it could be seen again, and Ethan Cole remained still for a moment, watching the thin seam widen just enough to reveal a narrow edge beneath. Wood, dark with age but preserved in a way that spoke of care rather than abandonment. The clock beside it rested open, silent now, its hands unmoving as if they had reached the moment they had been searching for, and Ethan felt that same stillness settle into his chest. Not fear, not hesitation, but something steadier, something that asked him to understand before he acted. He lowered himself slowly, one knee pressing into the cool earth, and placed his hand along the edge of the hidden panel, feeling the grain of the wood beneath the dust, smooth in places where it had been handled, rough where time had left its mark. He did not pull it open at once. Instead he paused, glancing up toward Nayeli, who had not moved from her place beyond the stones, her gaze fixed not on the ground, but on him, as if the choice mattered more than what lay beneath it. Ethan nodded once, not asking for permission, but acknowledging that this was not his alone, and then he lifted. The panel rose without resistance, revealing a shallow chamber carved into the earth, no deeper than a foot, lined with the same careful workmanship he had seen in the clock, and inside, There was no glitter of gold, no stacks of coin, only a small collection of objects arranged with deliberate intention. A folded piece of cloth, faded but intact, a leather-bound journal worn at the edges, and beneath them, a small metal box no larger than his hand. The absence of wealth struck him harder than its presence would have, because it meant this place had never been meant to hide riches. It had been meant to hold something else entirely. Ethan reached first for the cloth, lifting it gently, and as he unfolded it, the patterns revealed themselves, stitched in careful lines that matched the symbols on the stones, on the clock, on Naeli's shawl, and in the center, there was a mark he recognized now, not because he had seen it before, but because it had already begun to feel familiar. He set the cloth aside with care and picked up the journal, the leather soft from years of use, the binding still strong despite the time it had spent beneath the ground. When he opened it, the pages whispered softly, and the writing inside was neat, deliberate, the hand of someone who had taken time with each word. He read the first line in silence, his eyes moving slowly across the ink, and something in his expression shifted, not in shock, but in the quiet recognition of a story that had been waiting to be told. The journal spoke of a man, not unlike him, a rancher, a settler, someone who had come to this land believing it was empty, believing it was his to claim, and who had been proven wrong not by force, but by kindness. It spoke of a winter when the land had turned against him, when his cattle had failed and his water had frozen, and how he had been found, not by his own people, but by those he had been taught to fear. They had not taken from him. They had given food, shelter, time, and in return, he had been offered something greater than survival. He had been offered understanding. Ethan turned the page, the lantern light catching the ink as the story continued, detailing the man's choice to repay what had been given, not with money, not with trade, but with truth, by recording what he had seen, what he had been shown, and by hiding it where only someone willing to listen would find it. The clock, it said, had been part of that choice, not a curse, but a guide, a way to ensure that the story would not fall into hands that would twist it into something else. Ethan closed the journal slowly, the weight of it settling deeper than the metal of the watch ever had, and he reached for the small box last. It opened with a soft click, revealing inside not gold, but a collection of folded papers, official in their form, stamped and signed, documents that spoke of ownership, of boundaries drawn not by the land itself, but by men who had never truly seen it. Ethan did not need to read every line to understand what they meant. The names, the marks, the claims, they told a story of how this land had been taken, not through understanding, but through assumption. He sat back then, the open chamber before him, the objects laid out like pieces of a truth too long buried, and he felt the weight of the choice before him shift again, no longer about whether to take or leave, but about what it meant to carry what he now knew. He looked up toward Naeli once more, her figure unchanged, her presence steady, and in her silence there was no demand, no expectation, only the quiet acknowledgement that the truth had been found, and what came next would not be decided by her, or by the past, but by him. The clock remained still beside the chamber, its hands resting, its purpose fulfilled for this moment, and Ethan understood that it would move again, but not until he did. He gathered the journal carefully, holding it for a moment longer than necessary, feeling the weight of the words within it, and then he looked back at the box, at the papers that could change more than just his own life, that could shift the balance of what had been taken and what might yet be returned. The wind moved softly through the stones, carrying with it the scent of sage once more, and Ethan Cole sat there in the quiet of that hidden place, no longer a man chasing answers, but a man holding them, and knowing that what he did next would decide whether the story ended in silence or in something that could finally be heard. Ethan Cole did not rush the moment. He gathered the journal, the folded cloth, and the small metal box with a care that felt unfamiliar in his hands, as if each object carried a weight that did not belong to him alone. And when he rose from the ground, the circle of stones seemed quieter, not empty, but settled, like something long held had finally been acknowledged. The clock remained open at his side, its face still, its hands unmoving, and for the first time since he had taken it, there was no sound at all, no ticking, no pull, just silence that did not press against him but stood beside him. He looked toward Naeli, her figure steady at the edge of the light, and in that stillness he understood that she had not led him here. She had only made sure he did not turn away before he arrived. "It is not gold," he said, his voice low, not in disappointment but in realization, and she gave a slight nod, her gaze resting on the journal in his hand. "It never was," she answered, and the words carried no judgment, only truth. Ethan stepped forward, closing the distance between them slowly. The earth soft beneath his boots, the night air cooler now as if the land itself had exhaled. "These papers," he said, lifting the box slightly. "They could change things." And for a moment her eyes moved to the metal, then back to him, steady as before. "They could," she said. "Or they could be hidden again, as they were meant to be, until someone else is ready to see them without taking them." Ethan frowned slightly, the weight of that choice settling deeper, not as a burden, but as something that asked for more than a simple answer. He glanced back at the open chamber, at the place where the objects had rested for so long, and he felt the difference between possession and purpose, between owning something and understanding why it existed. "The man who wrote this," he said, tapping the journal lightly. "He wanted it found." And Naeli's expression shifted, not in disagreement, but in a quiet correction. "He wanted it remembered," she said. "And there is a difference." The wind moved gently through the stones again, carrying the scent of sage, and Ethan stood there, holding the past in his hands, knowing that whatever he chose would not erase what had been done, but it might shape what came next. He closed the journal carefully, placing it back into the chamber for a moment, as if testing the feeling of leaving it there, and something in his chest tightened, not in resistance, but in recognition that the story did not belong beneath the ground anymore. He picked it up again, this time with intention, and turned back toward the direction of his land, the faint outline of his cabin, barely visible in the distance. "If it stays here," he said, more to himself than to her, "nothing changes." And the words hung in the air, simple, undeniable. Naeli watched him for a long moment, her eyes searching not for the answer itself, but for the reason behind it. And then she stepped aside, not blocking his path, not guiding it, just making space for the choice he had already begun to make. Ethan bent once more, placing the folded cloth back into the chamber, smoothing it gently as if returning something sacred, and he set the empty metal box beside it, leaving the documents in his hand. He hesitated only a second before placing the clock on the edge of the opening, its lid still open, its face quiet, and for a brief moment nothing happened, the night holding its breath again, and then, softly, the ticking returned, not uneven, not searching, but steady, as if it had found what it needed in the decision he had made. Ethan straightened, the sound of the clock settling into the rhythm of the land, no longer pulling him forward, but anchoring him in place. He looked at Naeli once more, and this time there was no question in his gaze, only understanding. "It was never a curse," he said, and she shook her head gently. "No," she replied. "It was a test of what a man sees when he is given the truth." Ethan nodded once, the words settling into him, and without another glance back, he turned toward the path that would lead him out of the hills, the journal held close, the documents folded carefully against his chest. The stones did not guide him now. They did not need to, because the direction had already been chosen. Behind him, the circle remained, the chamber, open just enough to show that it had not been closed again, not sealed away, but left as it was meant to be, a place of memory rather than hiding. Naeli watched him go, her figure still against the dim horizon, and as the distance grew between them, the ticking of the clock softened, blending into the night until it was no longer a sound that could be heard, but something that could be felt. Ethan Cole walked on, no longer the man who had taken a watch from a saloon, but the man who carried a story that could not remain buried. And somewhere ahead, beyond the edge of his land, beyond the quiet town that had once turned its back on him, the morning waited, not to change what had been done, but to reveal what could still be made right. And if you have stayed with this story until this moment, thank you for listening, for standing in the quiet where choices are made without noise, and for understanding that sometimes the greatest change begins when a man decides to carry the truth, instead of leaving it behind. The horizon had not yet broken when Ethan Cole reached the edge of his land, but the darkness had thinned just enough to reveal the outline of his cabin, quiet and unchanged, as if the night had passed over it without leaving a mark. And for a moment he stopped, the journal pressed against his chest, the folded papers tucked beneath it, feeling the distance between the man who had left and the one who now returned. The air carried a faint chill, the kind that settles just before sunrise, and with it came the distant sound of town waking slowly, a door creaking open somewhere far off, a horse shifting its weight, the low murmur of a place that had not yet decided what the day would bring. Ethan stepped forward, boots steady, his pace unhurried, because there was no longer anything chasing him, no ticking urging him onward, only the quiet knowledge that what he carried would not wait forever. He pushed open the cabin door, the wood giving way with a soft sound, and stepped inside, placing the journal carefully on the table where the clock had once opened itself, the same table that now held nothing but the faint outline of where something had rested. The absence of the clock did not feel empty. It felt complete, as if its purpose had been fulfilled and it no longer needed to remain. Ethan moved to the small basin by the window, splashing a bit of water over his hands, the coolness grounding him in the present moment. And when he looked up, his reflection in the glass caught him by surprise, not because it had changed, but because he had. He dried his hands slowly, then turned back to the table, opening the journal once more, letting the pages fall where they had before, his eyes scanning the lines that now carried more meaning than they had in the quiet of the hills. He read not as a man searching for answers, but as one who had already found them and was learning how to hold them. Outside, the first light of dawn began to stretch across the land, thin and pale, touching the edges of the fields, the broken fence, the path that led toward town. Ethan closed the journal again, his fingers resting on the worn leather, and he knew that the next step would not be taken in silence, not in the hills, but in the place where the story had been misunderstood for far too long. He gathered the papers, folding them carefully, and slipped them into his coat, the weight familiar now, no longer foreign, no longer uncertain. When he stepped back outside, the light had grown stronger, painting the land in soft gold, and in that moment, everything looked the same, the cabin, the fields, the distant road, but Ethan understood that nothing truly was. He walked toward the path that led into Dust Hollow, each step measured, not because he was unsure, but because he was deliberate, aware that what he carried would not simply be accepted. That truth rarely was. The town came into view slowly, the buildings rising from the flat land like they always had, but the air felt different as he approached, as if the place itself sensed that something was about to shift. A few early risers glanced his way, their expressions unreadable, some curious, some cautious, and Ethan did not avoid their gaze. He met it, steady, unflinching, because he was no longer the man they had dismissed. He reached the center of town just as the sun broke fully over the horizon, its light catching the windows, the dust in the air, the faces of those beginning to gather, drawn not by noise, but by the quiet presence of something they did not yet understand. Ethan stopped near the saloon, the same place where it had all begun, and for a moment he simply stood there, the journal in his hand, the papers close against his chest, the memory of the clock still steady in his mind. The barkeep stepped out, wiping his hands on a cloth, his eyes narrowing slightly as he recognized Ethan, and behind him, a few others lingered, watching, waiting. Ethan did not raise his voice, did not call for attention. He simply placed the journal on the wooden counter outside, the same wood that had once held the weight of a different choice, and opened it. The pages caught the morning light, the ink clear, the words ready to be seen by more than just one man. "You all remember the story you told about that clock," he said, his voice calm, carrying just far enough to reach those nearby, and the murmurs began, quiet at first, then growing as more people stepped closer. "This is the story it was meant to tell," he continued, his hand resting lightly on the open page, not forcing anyone to look, but not hiding it either. The town did not respond all at once. It never did. Instead, it shifted slowly, one person leaning in, another stepping closer, eyes moving across the lines, reading, understanding in small pieces, in moments that built upon each other. Ethan stood there, not pushing, not explaining, simply holding the truth where it could be seen. And in that stillness, something began to change, not loud, not sudden, but real, somewhere. At the edge of the crowd, just beyond the line where the town ended and the land began, Nayeli stood once more, her presence quiet, her gaze steady, watching not the man, but the choice he had made. And in the way the morning light settled over the open pages, over the faces that now looked without turning away, there was a sense that the story, long buried, had finally found its way back into the open, carried not by force, but by a man willing to stand still long enough for others to see it for themselves. The first man who stepped closer did not speak. He simply leaned in, eyes narrowing as he read the lines Ethan had placed before him. And the silence that followed was not empty. It was heavy with something unfamiliar to the town, something that did not fit the stories they had told themselves for years. The barkeep stood still behind the counter, the cloth in his hand forgotten, his gaze fixed on the open journal, as if the words might change if he looked away too long, and one by one, others moved in, drawn not by curiosity alone, but by the quiet certainty in Ethan Cole's stance, a certainty they had never seen in him before. No one laughed, no one dismissed it, because the story written there did not ask for belief. It offered something harder, something that could not be easily turned aside. A woman near the edge of the gathering lowered her head slightly as she read, her fingers tightening around the shawl at her shoulders, and a man beside her shifted his weight, glancing from the page to the land beyond the buildings as if seeing it for the first time without the filter of ownership. Ethan did not move, his hand resting lightly on the wood, not claiming the journal, not guarding it, just keeping it open, steady, available. The morning light grew stronger, spilling across the street, touching the dust, the boots, the worn edges of the buildings, and it caught the ink on the page in a way that made each word stand out, clear and undeniable. Someone spoke then, quiet, but enough to carry. This says the land was never signed over the way we thought. And the words hung there, not shouted, not argued, just present. Another voice followed, uncertain. Says he was helped, that he stayed, that he knew. And there was something in that knowing that unsettled more than any accusation could. The barkeep finally stepped forward, his eyes moving across the line slowly, his jaw tightening not in anger, but in the recognition of something he could not easily deny. "Where did you find this?" he asked, his voice lower than usual, and Ethan met his gaze without hesitation. "Where it was meant to be found," he answered, and he did not offer more. Because more was not needed. The town shifted again, not outwardly, not with noise or movement, but inwardly, as if each person carried the weight of the words in their own way, measuring them against what they had always believed. A young man near the back stepped closer, reading over the shoulder of another, and his expression changed, not dramatically, but enough to show that something had taken hold. He straightened slowly, looking out toward the hills, toward the land that had always been there, and for a moment he did not speak, as if words would not yet come. Ethan watched them all, not with expectation, not waiting for agreement or apology, just present, allowing the truth to exist in the open without force. The papers in his coat felt heavier now, not because of what they were, but because of what they could confirm, and he knew that showing them would come next, but not yet. Not until the story itself had been seen for what it was. A breeze moved through the street, lifting a thin layer of dust, carrying the scent of the land beyond the town, and it seemed to settle differently now, not as something to be pushed aside, but as something to be noticed. The barkeep closed the journal gently, not snapping it shut, not rejecting it, just pausing the moment, and he looked at Ethan again, his expression no longer guarded, but searching. "If this is true," he said, the words slow, careful, "then everything we built here." And he did not finish the sentence, because he did not need to. Ethan nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement that the question itself mattered more than the answer. "Then you decide what it means," he said, and there was no challenge in his tone, no demand, just the quiet offering of responsibility. The crowd did not disperse, not right away. They remained where they were, some looking back at the journal, others looking out toward the land, and a few simply standing still, as if the ground beneath them had shifted just enough to be felt, but not yet understood. At the edge of it all, where the last building gave way to open space, Naeli stood as she had before, her presence unchanged, her gaze moving across the faces, not searching for reaction, but witnessing the moment for what it was, a turning, however small. The sun climbed higher, casting longer light across the street, and in that light, the town did not look different, not in any visible way, but something within it had begun to move, not loudly, not completely, but enough. Ethan stepped back then, just a single pace, creating space between himself and the journal, between himself and the choice that now belonged to others as much as to him. He reached into his coat slowly, feeling the folded papers beneath his fingers, and he knew that when he brought them out, the quiet would deepen, the understanding would sharpen, but he did not rush it, because the truth did not need to be forced into the open. It only needed to be placed where it could be seen. The wind shifted once more, carrying the scent of sage through the town, faint but present, and for a brief moment, it felt as though the land itself was listening, waiting, just as it had waited for so long. And in that stillness, Ethan Cole stood not as a man apart from the town, but as one who had brought something back to it, something that had never truly been lost, only forgotten, and now, slowly, carefully, it was being remembered. The silence did not break all at once. It shifted, like weight moving across old wood, subtle at first, then enough to be noticed, and Ethan Cole could see it in the way the townsfolk stood, no longer just watching but thinking, each man and woman measuring the words they had read against the life they had lived on this land. The barkeep kept one hand resting on the journal, not closing it again, not pushing it away, just keeping it there as if it might anchor the moment, and his eyes lifted slowly toward Ethan, searching not for answers now, but for certainty that this was not some trick of ink and paper. Ethan did not move to reassure him, did not speak, because reassurance was not something that could be given here. It had to be found, and the only way to find it was to look again, to read again, to let the truth sit long enough to take root. A man near the front, older, with lines cut deep into his face by years of sun and stubbornness, cleared his throat quietly and stepped closer, his fingers brushing the edge of the page as if testing whether it was real. And then he read aloud, not loudly, but enough that those nearest could hear, words about winter, about survival, about a kindness given without condition. His voice faltered once, just for a moment, and then steadied, carrying the story forward. And as he spoke, something in the crowd shifted again, not outwardly, but inwardly, a soft recognition passing from one to another. A woman who had kept her distance moved a step closer, her eyes fixed on the lines, and when the older man paused, she continued, her voice quieter but no less steady, reading the part where the man in the journal had chosen not to take what was not his, where he had written of the land not as property, but as something entrusted to those who understood it. The words hung in the air, not as accusation, not as demand, but as something that asked to be seen without defense. Ethan watched them, not counting how many listened, not measuring how many believed, only noting the change in their posture, in the way their shoulders no longer held the same rigid certainty they had carried before. The sun climbed higher, its light stronger now, casting clearer lines across the street, and in that light, the dust did not hide as much. It revealed, showing the wear on boots, the cracks in wood, the truth of things that had always been there, but not always noticed. The barkeep finally spoke. Again, his voice lower, more careful than before. If this was written true, then someone knew all along. And he did not look at Ethan when he said it. He looked at the journal, as if the answer might still be there between the lines. Ethan reached into his coat then, slow enough that no one felt startled, and drew out the folded papers, holding them for a moment before placing them beside the open journal. The movement was simple, but it carried a weight that settled across the crowd like a quiet understanding. He unfolded the top page, smoothing it with his hand, revealing the official marks, the signatures, the boundaries drawn in ink that did not match the story that had been told. No one spoke at first, not because they did not understand, but because they did, and that understanding did not come with noise. The older man leaned in again, his eyes moving across the document, and this time he did not read aloud. He simply nodded once, slow, as if confirming something he had not wanted to consider before. Another man stepped forward, younger, his gaze sharper, and he read in silence, his jaw tightening not in anger, but in the realization that what he had been taught did not hold. Against what he now saw, the barkeep exhaled, a quiet sound that seemed to carry years of certainty leaving him, and he rested both hands on the counter, looking from the journal to the papers and then out toward the land beyond the town. "We built on this," he said, not as a defense, not as a justification, but as a statement that now held a different meaning. Ethan nodded slightly, his eyes following the same line of sight toward the hills, toward the place where the stones still stood, where the truth had waited without needing to be forced into the open. "You built because you believed it was yours," he said, his voice steady, not accusing, not softening, just stating what was. The younger man looked up then, his expression uncertain. "And now?" he asked, the words incomplete but clear enough. Ethan did not answer immediately, because the answer did not belong to him alone, and that was the point. He glanced toward the edge of the town, toward the open space where the buildings ended and the land began. And there, as before, Nayeli stood, her presence unchanged, her gaze steady on the moment unfolding. "Now," Ethan said finally, turning back to the crowd, "you decide what you do with the truth you have been given." And the words settled, not as a command, not as a solution, but as a weight placed gently into their hands. The crowd did not disperse. Not yet. They remained where they were, some looking at the papers again, others looking at each other, and a few turning their gaze outward, toward the land that had always been there but now felt different, not because it had changed, but because they had begun to see it without the same certainty. The wind moved again, carrying the scent of sage through the street, and this time, more than one person noticed, their heads turning slightly, their breath slowing, as if the land itself had stepped closer without moving at all. Ethan stepped back another pace, creating more space between himself and the counter, between himself and the choice that now rested with them. And in that space, the silence held, not empty, not uncertain, but full of something that did not need to be spoken to be understood. The journal lay open, the papers spread beside it, the light catching both in equal measure. And for the first time since he had walked into that saloon, Ethan Cole felt that the story was no longer his to carry alone. It had been placed where it could be seen, where it could be remembered, and what came next would not be decided in the noise of argument, but in the quiet of what each person chose to do when they walked away from that place and stepped back onto the land that now felt just a little more honest beneath their feet. The town did not return to what it had been, not that morning, not after the words had been seen and the papers had been laid bare beneath the rising sun, because once a man reads something that cannot be unseen, the ground beneath him does not feel the same again, and Ethan Cole stood just far enough back to watch it happen without stepping into it, his hands empty now, his part in the telling already done. The journal remained open on the counter, the pages no longer just ink but something that had begun to breathe in the minds of those who leaned over it, reading not for curiosity but for confirmation of what they had started to feel. The older man who had read aloud earlier closed the distance again, his movements slower now, more deliberate, and he placed his hand flat against the wood beside the journal as if steadying himself, his eyes moving across the lines one more time before lifting toward the others. "We cannot pretend this was not written," he said, his voice carrying just enough to reach the edges of the gathering, not loud, not forceful, but certain. No one answered him right away, because the truth did not need defending. It only needed acknowledging, and that took time. The younger man who had studied the papers earlier stepped closer to the counter, his brow furrowed, his gaze shifting between the documents and the land beyond the buildings. And when he spoke, it was not with defiance, but with a question that had no easy answer. If this land was never meant to be taken the way it was, then what do we do with what we have built? And the words settled heavily, not as an argument, but as a reflection of what each person there was beginning to understand. The barkeep exhaled slowly, his hands resting on the counter, his eyes no longer avoiding the pages, and he nodded once, not in agreement with any one idea, but in recognition that the question itself mattered. Ethan watched them, his gaze steady, his posture unchanged, because this was not a moment to lead. It was a moment to witness, to allow the town to stand in its own understanding without being pushed. A woman near the front, the same one who had read from the journal, drew her shawl tighter around her shoulders and stepped forward, her voice quiet but clear. "We were told one story, and we lived by it. But this is another." And she did not finish, because the difference between the two did not need to be explained. It could be felt in the way the air had shifted. The wind moved through the street again, carrying that faint scent of sage, and this time more heads turned toward it, not in confusion, but in recognition that something beyond the town was part of this moment as well. At the edge of it all, Nayeli remained where she had been, her presence unchanged, her gaze steady not on the papers, but on the people, as if measuring not what they had read, but what they would do with it. The older man straightened, his shoulders squaring slightly, and he looked toward the younger man who had spoken. "We cannot undo what has been done," he said, his voice steady. "But we can decide what we do now that we know." And there was something in that statement that settled into the space between them, not offering a solution, but opening a path. The younger man nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful, and he looked again at the documents, his fingers hovering over the edge of the page before pulling back, as if understanding that this was not something to be handled lightly. The barkeep reached out then, closing the journal gently, not to hide it, not to end the moment, but to mark a pause, and he looked at Ethan for the first time with something that resembled respect rather than suspicion. "You brought this here," he said, and it was not a question. Ethan met his gaze, his expression calm. "It was already here," he replied, and the simplicity of that answer carried more weight than any explanation could have. The barkeep nodded once, slowly, and stepped back from the counter, giving space not just to Ethan, but to the town itself, as if acknowledging that this was no longer about a single man or a single object, but about what they all now carried. The crowd did not disperse, not completely, but it began to shift, small groups forming, quiet conversations starting, not loud, not heated, but thoughtful, each person trying to place what they had seen into the life they knew. Some looked toward the hills, toward the land that stretched beyond their buildings, and for the first time, their gaze did not carry the same certainty of ownership, but something else, something closer to awareness. Ethan stepped back another pace, the distance between him and the counter widening, not as retreat, but as release, because the story had been placed where it needed to be, and what followed would not be his to control. He turned his head slightly, his eyes finding Nayeli at the edge of the town, and for a brief moment, their gazes met, not as strangers, not as opposing sides, but as two people who understood that the truth had done what it needed to do. She inclined her head just slightly, a gesture so small it could have been missed, but Ethan saw it, and in that moment, he understood that the choice had been made not in a single act, but in the willingness to let the truth stand without force. The sun rose higher, casting stronger light across the town, and in that light, Dust Hollow did not look like a place undone. It looked like a place beginning to see itself clearly for the first time, and Ethan Cole, standing at the edge of it, no longer felt the weight of the clock or the pull of something unfinished, because what had been hidden was now in the open, and the rest would come not from him, but from what each person chose to do when they walked away from that counter and stepped back into a world that no longer fit the story they had once believed. The town did not erupt into action. It settled into something quieter, something slower, like a long breath held too long finally being released, and Ethan Cole remained where he stood, watching as men and women who had once moved with certainty now moved with care, their steps measured not by habit, but by thought. The small groups that had formed began to speak in low voices, not arguing, not defending, but asking, and the questions carried further than any answer could, reaching into the spaces between buildings, into the gaps where assumptions had once lived unquestioned. The older man who had spoken before turned away from the counter and looked out across the land beyond the town, his eyes narrowing not in suspicion, but in focus, as if he were seeing distances he had never truly considered. "We built fences," he said, not to anyone in particular, his voice steady. "But we never asked what they meant." And the words lingered, simple but heavy. The younger man stepped beside Him, his posture no longer rigid, his gaze following the same line toward the hills. "We thought they meant safety," he replied quietly. "But maybe they meant something else." And neither of them finished, because the meaning was already beginning to take shape without needing to be named. The barkeep remained near the counter, his hands resting on the wood, his eyes moving from the closed journal to the people around him. And there was a shift in him as well, a subtle loosening of something that had once been fixed. He reached for the journal again, not to close it further, but to open it once more, turning it slightly so that more could see. And in that small gesture, there was a willingness to let the story remain visible, to not tuck it away where it could be forgotten again. A woman who had not spoken before stepped closer, her gaze steady as she looked at the pages, and then at the papers beside them, her voice soft but clear. "If this is true, then someone chose to remember before we chose to forget." And there was something in that statement that carried both weight and direction. Ethan listened without stepping in, his presence no longer central, but still grounded, as if he had become part of the space rather than standing apart from it. His eyes drifted once more toward the edge of the town, toward the place where Naeli stood, and though she had not moved, there was a quiet change in her stance, not in position, but in presence, as if the waiting had shifted into witnessing. The wind carried through again, softer now, less insistent, and with it came a sense that the land itself was no longer holding back, that it was allowing this moment to unfold without resistance. A man near the back of the gathering stepped forward, hesitating only briefly before speaking. "What if we bring this to the county?" he said, his voice uncertain but earnest. "What if we show them what we found?" And the suggestion did not spark immediate agreement, but it did not meet dismissal either. The older man turned to him, considering. "That would make it real beyond here," he said, and the words carried both possibility and consequence. The younger man nodded slowly. "It already is," he replied, glancing at the journal, then at the land. "We just have to decide if we are willing to live with it." The barkeep exhaled again, a quiet sound that seemed to mark the passing of something unspoken, and he looked toward Ethan once more, not for direction, but for acknowledgement. Ethan gave a slight nod, not offering approval, not claiming the idea, just recognizing that the choice was moving forward without him needing to push it. The crowd shifted again, not dispersing, but reforming, the conversations deepening, the questions becoming more specific, more grounded, as if the abstract had begun to take shape in the practical. Some spoke of landlines, of records, of what could be verified, while others spoke of something less tangible, of respect, of what it meant to live on a place that held more history than they had been told. Through it all, the journal remained open, the papers visible, the truth not hidden, not forced, just present. Ethan stepped back another pace, then another, his movement slow, almost unnoticed, as he allowed the space to belong fully to those who now stood within it. He did not turn away completely, not yet, but his stance shifted, less anchored to the moment, more ready to leave it behind, because he understood that his role had changed, that what he had carried into the town was no longer his to hold. His gaze found Naeli again, and this time, when their eyes met, there was no question left between them, no uncertainty about what had been done or what would come next, only a quiet understanding that the truth had been placed where it needed to be, and that its path forward would be shaped not by force, but by the choices of those who had received it. She inclined her head once more, a gesture so slight it could have been mistaken for the movement of the wind, and then she turned, not abruptly, not in retreat, but with a calm that matched the land itself, stepping away from the edge of the town and back toward the open space beyond it. Ethan watched her go for a moment longer, then turned as well, his path leading not into the center of the town, but along its edge, back toward the quiet stretch of land he had called his, though he now understood that the word carried less weight than it once had. Behind him, the voices continued, low, thoughtful, steady, and in them there was no longer the certainty of a single story, but the beginning of something more complex, something that did not resolve easily, but did not need to. The sun climbed higher, casting its light evenly across both the town and the land beyond it. And in that light, the difference between what had been believed and what was now known did not stand in conflict, but in contrast. each making the other clearer, and Ethan Cole walked on, not carrying the clock, not guided by its ticking, but moving with a quiet certainty that the most important part of the journey had never been about finding what was hidden, but about choosing what to do once it was seen. The road away from the center of town felt longer than it had that morning, not because the distance had changed, but because the weight of what had been left behind no longer belonged to Ethan Cole alone. And as he walked along the edge where the last building gave way to open land, he could still hear the low murmur of voices carrying behind him, not loud, not restless, but steady, as if the town had found a new rhythm it did not yet fully understand. The sun had climbed higher now, casting a clean light across the fields, across the worn fences, across the ground that had always been there, but now seemed to hold a different kind of presence, something quieter, something that did not ask to be owned but to be recognized. Ethan slowed as he reached the boundary of his land, the same stretch of earth he had walked countless times before, and he paused there, not out of uncertainty, but out of awareness, because the line he had once believed in felt thinner now, less defined by posts and wire and more by something he could not see but could feel. He stepped across it anyway, not claiming it, not abandoning it, simply moving through it as a man who understood that the ground did not change beneath his feet just because he had learned its story. The cabin stood where he had left it, quiet and still, its shadow shorter now in the midday light. And for a moment he just looked at it, the place that had held his silence, his doubts, his small, steady life, and he realized that it had not been separate from the story he had uncovered. It had been part of it all along. He walked up to the door and rested his hand against the wood, feeling the warmth of the sun soaked into it. And then he pushed it open, stepping inside without hesitation. The room was as he had left it, simple, unchanged, the table still bearing the faint marks where the clock had once rested, where the journal had been opened, where the first understanding had begun to take shape. Ethan moved to the table and sat down slowly, his hands resting on the surface, not holding anything now, not carrying the journal or the papers, because he had left them where they needed to be seen. The absence of those objects did not feel like loss. It felt like completion, like a task finished not by force, but by decision. Outside, the wind moved lightly across the land, and through the open window it carried the same faint scent of sage, softer now, less insistent, as if the land itself no longer needed to call out to be noticed. Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair, his gaze drifting to the window, to the horizon beyond it, and for the first time in a long while, he did not feel the need to chase anything, to fix anything, to prove anything. He simply sat, letting the quiet settle around him, not heavy, not empty, just present. Time passed in that stillness, though he did not measure it, not by the sun, not by any ticking sound, because there was none now, and in that absence, he found something steadier than before. Eventually, he rose, stepping back outside, the light now strong, the day fully awake, and he walked a short distance from the cabin, stopping where the land opened out before him. He looked toward the hills where the stones lay hidden, toward the town where the voices still moved in low conversation, and he understood that both places now carried the same truth, one held in memory, the other in choice. He did not expect the town to change overnight, did not expect fences to fall or boundaries to vanish, because change like that did not come with noise, it came with time, with small decisions made quietly, one after another. He stood there for a long moment, the wind brushing against him, the sun warming the ground, and he felt something settle within him, not pride, not relief, but a kind of balance, as if the weight he had carried had been placed where it belonged. In the distance, a figure moved along the edge of the hills, small against the wide land. And though he could not see her clearly, he knew it was Nayeli, her path not toward him, not toward the town, but along the line where the land remained open, unclaimed in the way men understood claiming. Ethan watched until she disappeared from view, not because he expected her to return, but because her presence had marked something in him that would not fade with distance. He turned then, looking back at his cabin, at the land around it, and he did not see it as something to hold on to or to give away, but as something to live within, with a different understanding than before. The day stretched ahead, simple in its tasks, quiet in its demands, and Ethan Cole stepped forward into it, not as a man defined by what he had found, but by what he had chosen to do with it, knowing that the story did not end with the uncovering of truth, but with the way it continued to shape the lives that moved across the land long after it had been spoken. The days that followed did not announce themselves as different. They arrived the same way they always had, with light stretching slowly across the land and the wind moving through the grass in quiet patterns. But something beneath that surface had shifted, something that did not need to be seen to be felt, and Ethan Cole noticed it not in grand changes, but in the small, steady ways the world responded. The fence line that once felt like a boundary now felt like a marker of where he had been, rather than what he owned. And when he walked along it in the early hours, he did not measure distance in acres. He measured it in understanding. The town, too, moved differently, not all at once, not in a way that could be pointed to and named, but in the choices people made when they thought no one was watching. The older man who had spoken that morning began to leave sections of his fence open where the land naturally flowed, not removing it entirely, not making a statement, just allowing space where there had once been none. The younger man spent long hours with the county records, not arguing, not demanding, but comparing, reading, learning what had been written and what had been assumed, his posture no longer driven by certainty, but by care. The barkeep kept the journal beneath the counter, not hidden, not displayed, but available, and when someone asked about it, he did not tell them what to think. He simply placed it before them and let the words do their work. Ethan did not stand in the center of any of it. He moved along the edges, tending to his land, fixing what needed fixing, leaving what did not. And in that quiet way, he became part of the change without needing to lead it. Sometimes, as the sun lowered and the light softened, he would look toward the hills, toward the place where the stones stood in their silent circle, and he would feel a steady calm settle in his chest, not because the story had ended, but because it had found its place. He did not return there often, not out of avoidance, but out of respect, understanding that some places did not need to be revisited to remain known. One evening, as the sky turned a deep shade of gold, and the air cooled just enough to carry the scent of sage once more, Ethan walked a little farther than usual, past the edge of his land, toward the open stretch where the town gave way to something wider. He did not expect to see her, but he did, Nayeli standing as she had before, not waiting, not watching, just present, her gaze resting on the horizon as if it held something only she could read. He slowed as he approached, not out of caution, but out of recognition, and when he stopped a few feet away, she turned slightly, acknowledging him without surprise. "They are listening," she said, her voice quiet, and Ethan nodded once, his eyes following the same line toward the distant shapes of the town. "Some are," he replied, and there was no disappointment in his tone, only honesty. She considered that for a moment, then gave a slight nod. "That is how it begins," she said. And the simplicity of her words carried more truth than any long explanation. They stood there in silence for a while, the wind moving gently around them, the land stretching out in every direction, and in that silence, there was no need for more. Ethan glanced at her once more. "The clock," he said, not as a question, but as a thought left unfinished, and she met his gaze, her expression calm. "It does not need to move anymore," she answered. And he understood, not because he saw it, but because he felt it, the absence of its ticking no longer a loss, but a sign that its purpose had been fulfilled. He nodded again, and without another word, she turned, stepping away as she always had, her figure blending into the open land until she was no longer visible, leaving behind not an emptiness, but a sense of completion. Ethan remained where he was for a moment longer, the light fading, the air cooling, and then he turned as well, walking back toward his cabin, toward the simple life that now carried a different meaning. The town behind him continued in its quiet shift, the land around him remained steady and unchanged, and somewhere between those two, the truth he had carried had found its place, not in a single moment, not in a single decision, but in the way it continued to live on in the choices of those who had seen it. And in that quiet balance, with no sound to mark it, no words to declare it, the story came to rest not as something finished, but as something understood, the kind of understanding that does not need to be spoken to remain true. Thanks for watching this story. Subscribe to the channel for more heartfelt stories. Your support helps keep these stories alive. Tell me in the comments what you felt about this story and what kind of stories you want to see next. See you in the next story.